has been a lot of chatter and excitement in prophetic circles lately over the Messiah 2030 theory and its implications for a rapture in 2023. Is there any meat on the bones of this theory? Is this theory legit? Does this theory tell us that the rapture must happen this year in 2023? Is this theory science, sloppy science, or superstition? Stay tuned for a reasoned response to this theory. Hi there, I'm Lee Brainerd. Welcome to Soothkeep and another edition of Prophecy in the Crucible. My mission is truth, truth at any cost, truth above every other consideration. Now, before we jump into today's topic, I want to clarify my position on the rapture, on imminency, and on watching for the imminent rapture. This video is not intended to discourage anybody from watching for the soon rapture, from believing in the imminency of the rapture. Hopefully nobody will come to such conclusions. Folks, we are commanded to watch for the rapture. We should be watching for the rapture every day. Every day. Indeed, the world around us is being rocked by a hurricane of convergence that is strengthening rapidly. You have to be blind to not see these things. And the stage setting for the tribulation is so far advanced that every day from here on out is a high watch day. The rapture can literally happen any day from here off into the future. The only thing that I am discouraging is the 2030 Messiah dating theory, which is going to go belly up like every other dating theory. When this theory is thoroughly debunked by the brutal facts of passing time, and that is going to happen, don't be discouraged, folks. The promises of God and the prophetic convergence is still with us. They're still shining brightly, and they're still holding out the promise of the soon rapture. And we are going to be even closer to His precious coming. Well, a number of videos have recently presented some form or another of the 2030 Messiah theory. One popular video was called Messiah 2030, and many others have appeared which have 2030 in the title, and some have 2023 in the title. The latter are focusing primarily on the rapture aspect. But these videos all have a common theme. The theme is that Christ was crucified in AD 30, and we take the 6,000-year theory, we add 2,000 years, we come to 2030, so 2030 is the second coming. But many of them have also deduced from this theory a 2023 rapture. Now, the rapture aspect in these videos is all over the map. Some have associated the rapture with the New Wine Pentecost, the supposed New Wine Pentecost. Others have associated with the Feast of Trumpets, the standard dating for the Feast of Trumpets. Others have associated with alternate dates for the Feast of Trumpets. And some even have quirky astronomical dates for the Feast of Trumpets. Now, I'm going to present 5 lines of argument here that I've found in these videos for the 2030 Messiah theory. The first is the 6,000-year theory. That is the theory that 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years. And we have 6 days for the saints to labor in the world and 1 day of rest. The second are the Rabbinical legends regarding 40-year phenomena that started in AD 30 and went until the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. The third is sensational dating theories like the supposed Bereshit prophecy in Genesis 1:1 and the supposed Acharit prophecy in Isaiah 46:10. The fourth are non-exegetical arguments that involve things like gematria, astrological signs in the heavens, and various other forms of numerology. The fifth class of arguments are the chronological arguments that men use that fudge the chronological constraints that are associated with the topic of the dating of the cross. They fudge those constraints and force those constraints to fit with their AD cross theory. Now, we're going to examine each of these classes of arguments in turn. We're going to examine their strengths and their weaknesses, and we're going to zero in on what support they offer, if any, for an AD 30 cross. And then we're going to examine the chronological constraints that must be honestly dealt with if we are going to take up the question of the year of the cross and do that subject justice. And then we're going to look at four chronological constraints, which, if you're going to deal honestly with the material, positively and absolutely forbid an AD 30 cross. And then finally, we're going to demonstrate that the AD 33 cross readily satisfies all of those chronological constraints, and it is the absolute best date for the cross of Christ Jesus. So let's start with the first argument, the 1,000-year day theory. One video that I watched actually forwarded dozens of arguments to corroborate this theory that one day is as 1,000 years. There's going to be 6,000 years or 6 days of the believers laboring in this ungodly world, and then there's going to be one glorious day of rest when the Lord comes. And out of these dozens of arguments, there were many typologies, there were many analogies, and many number patterns. And some of them I thought were really super cool arguments that reminded me of dear brother Chuck Missler. But some of the arguments seemed far-fetched or stretched. They didn't quite resonate with me. And there were a few of them that actually didn't even seem like arguments at all. And moreover, many of the arguments were not really independent arguments. They were just a previous argument that's being rehashed from a different angle. So really, when I put it all together, there really isn't dozens of arguments for this point. There's really only one foundation argument and then a few corroborating arguments. Nevertheless, even if 80 or 90% of these corroborating arguments are invalid or are stretched a little bit, the base argument of the 6,000 years and 1,000 year theory is fundamentally correct. So let's look at this base argument here. Let's start with the Sabbath pattern that was introduced in the garden, where we have 6 days of work and a 7th day of rest. We read it, for instance, in Genesis 2:3. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all of his work which God had created and made. Then let's turn to Hosea chapter 5, verses 5:15 through 6:2. I'm only going to read 6:2 here, but encourage you to go back and read the entire context. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up that we may live in his sight. Now, in the context, which I've encouraged you to read, the Lord gets tired of dealing with Israel. He forsakes Israel. He goes to his place in glory, and he's going to stay there until he returns after 2,000 years. And then when he returns, he's going to restore and bless Israel. Now, this passage here implies there's 2,000 years from the cross to the second coming and the start of the kingdom, and the kingdom is the 3rd day. Remember, at the cross, God rent the veil, and he set the temple aside. He set his dealings with national Israel aside. Not his dealings with them absolutely, but his dealings with them as his current testimony on earth of the work of God. The current testimony is the church. We see more of this principle taught in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. And there we read, "But, beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as 1 day." Now the context here, if you remember, is the promise of his coming that's being challenged by scoffers. And God reminds the saints not to listen to the scoffers, because he is not delaying his coming the way he's being accused of delaying his coming. He's not delaying his coming the way some reckon his coming being delayed. He's simply long-suffering, wishing that none should perish. So every day that the rapture is delayed is one more glorious day for the glorious offer of the glorious gospel. We're not getting ripped off if the rapture doesn't happen today or next week or this year. We're not getting ripped off, folks. The devil's getting ripped off, because the farther out that rapture gets pushed up to a point, the more souls that are being saved. Now, I also want to point out that this passage here in 2 Peter chapter 3, when it's talking about the 1 day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years is as 1 day, that this is a general timing principle. It's not a date-setting principle. We have to bear that in mind. And it's not a mystical principle either. It's just simply a generic timing principle that belongs in the same category as the fig tree generation, or the loaf or the lump being leavened with the mystery of iniquity. We also can look at Hebrews chapter 4. I'm not going to read out of this passage. I'm just going to direct your attention to it and point out that the passage clearly teaches that the coming millennium is God's promised Sabbath rest. It's not talking about the rest of faith that we enjoy right now as we're wandering in the wilderness. It's talking about the presence and enjoyment of rest after we're done with our time of wilderness journey. So if we take a full breakdown of this pattern from the passages that we've looked at, there's 4,000 years from Adam to the cross, and 2,000 years from the cross to the second coming. And then there's 1,000 years of the kingdom. Now, this 6,000-year theory isn't a newcomer in eschatology. It's not the new kid on the block. This theory is an ancient theory with a long and storied history. Many Jewish rabbis prior to the time of the church held this theory long before the New Testament was written. And many early church fathers like Irenaeus in his Against Heresies chapter 5 mentioned this, along with other fathers like Barnabas and Hippolytus and Methodius and Lactantius and Victorinus. Now, personally, I love this argument. The Sabbath pattern has been in my prophetic toolbox for over 30 years. There's 6,000 years for the godly to suffer, and then 1,000 years for the godly to enjoy glorious rest in the glorious kingdom. But as I mentioned earlier, the proper place for this argument is not a date-setting principle. It's just a general season principle. And it belongs in the same category as the fig tree generation that we read about in Matthew 24, verses 32 through 34. The fact is that we have no idea what the size of the window is that happens between the rapture and the beginning of the 70th week. We don't know if we have weeks or months or even a year or two, maybe 3 years in this window. And we might also be missing some variable that belongs in the second coming equation. And if we're missing it and we're leaving it out of the equation, then our estimation of our proximity to the second coming, and therefore our proximity to the tribulation, and therefore our proximity to the rapture, can be off a little bit. Now, we're not going to be off decades, folks, but we could be off. Now, the bottom line is, though, I love this argument. I absolutely love this argument. However, It doesn't prove or imply or necessitate an AD 30 cross. It only demonstrates that there are 6,000 years from Adam to the start of the kingdom. And this theory is going to work with any potential cross date. It works with AD 30, works with AD 31, works with AD 32, works with AD 33, and it works with those few folks who think it's AD 34. All you have to do is just add 2,000 years to the cross date to get to the date of the kingdom. Now, as I pointed out, I do believe that this theory is exact. I just want to temper our excitement about this theory with the fact that there's variables that we do not know, such that we don't know how long the rapture window is, and we're not absolutely certain of the cross. I have relative certainty on it, but it's not absolute. And we also might be missing a variable that belongs in the equation. So let me pull up a chart here so that this will help clarify in your mind exactly how these pieces play together. Notice that we have 7 1,000-year-long days in this chart. And notice there's a group of 4 days that run from Adam to the cross, and there's a second group of 2 days that runs from the cross to the second coming, and then we have the second coming ushering in the seventh day, which is the 1,000 years of rest. So hopefully this chart will help you understand what we just talked about. Well, let's move on to the next argument, this number 2 argument, which is the Rabbinical argument. And this here is a relatively complex argument that involves some very interesting phenomena mentioned in the Talmud. And we don't know for sure if they're actual historical facts or things that are based on facts, or if they're actually just kind of like the same kind of fairy tales that appear in Roman Catholicism. But for the sake of argument, we're going to take them as actual, legitimate historical occurrences. Anyway, these occurrences occurred or happened 40 years prior, or they started happening 40 years prior, and they occurred all the way through to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, the 4 most common arguments that are given out of the Talmud is the western light in the lampstand went out regularly for 40 years until the destruction of the temple. The second one is the scarlet wool that was attached to the temple door on the Feast of Atonement didn't turn white for 4 decades, which seemed to signify to the rabbis that God wasn't forgiving their sin. The third one is that the Sanhedrin was forced to move from their ideal location near the temple gate to a place called the Trading Place 40 years prior to the fall of Jerusalem. It's suspected that the stone lintel over the door broke and that that wall caved in. The fourth is the massive iron gates of the temple, who had large steel bolts that dropped deep into a stone floor, opened on their own about the 6th hour of the night on a number of occasions 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, men assume that these events and a few others that are similar demand that AD 30 be the year of the cross. But they're assuming that these point to the cross, and that assumption, to me, seems actually rather arbitrary. I'm convinced that the beginning of Christ's ministry in AD 30 better fits these rabbinical traditions, whether they're true or false, better than a crucifixion of Christ in AD 30. The western light was extinguished when the true light began his ministry in Jerusalem. The scarlet wool testified that there was no forgiveness through the temple system when the true source of forgiveness began to minister in Jerusalem. The one with the power to forgive sin was in their midst. The Sanhedrin was forced to leave their temple location when the true interpreter of the word began his ministry in Jerusalem. And the gate of the temple opened on its own when he who was the true door into the holy place began his public ministry in Jerusalem. Now, if these rabbinical traditions point to the start of Christ's Jerusalem ministry in AD 30, then they mesh perfectly with an AD 33 cross. So let's look at a chart that clarifies for you these rabbinical 40-year oddities. Starting on the left, the signs begin in AD 30 when the Messiah begins his ministry in Jerusalem. And those signs continue for 40 years. And the signs end in AD 70 when the Romans destroy Jerusalem and the temple. Now, note too that the Messiah was crucified after he'd presented signs for 3.5 years. Both the ones that are mentioned in the Bible and supposedly the ones that are mentioned in the Talmud. Now, as I mentioned, I think that these 40-year signs better fit the Messiah beginning his ministry in Jerusalem in AD 30 than they do with the Messiah being crucified in AD 30. Think about it. When the true light arrived, the western light in the temple went out. When the true door arrived, the temple door opened. Well, let's move on to the third argument, which is the sensational timing theories. Now, there were a number of gee-whiz arguments given in some of these videos, like the supposed Bereshit prophecy in Genesis 1:1 and the supposed accurate prophecy in Isaiah 46:10, which appear to directly or indirectly point to an AD 30 cross. And these arguments undoubtedly have a powerful appeal. But these arguments face two serious problems. The first problem is internal evidence. They are just way too fanciful and way too convoluted to be true. Plus, they feature dubious math, dubious history, and dubious connections. The second is external evidence. They are contradicted by straightforward historical observations and chronological constraints which forbid an AD 30 cross. Now, and we're going to examine these arguments shortly. I have as a foundation principle that gee-whiz arguments, no matter how cool, must surrender immediately and absolutely and unconditionally when challenged by straightforward biblical revelation and or historical facts. Sadly, men get infatuated with these gee-whiz arguments and theories, and when they do, they're more than happy to massage historical data and massage biblical passages to fit them with their theory. Folks, don't do that. Don't go there. Tremble at the Word of God 1,000 times more than you tremble at theories. Tremble at the historical facts 10 times more than you tremble at theories. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on these arguments because the bottom line is no matter how cool they are, no matter how much they wow men, if the historical facts and the chronological constraints forbid an AD 30 cross, then these arguments are just simply wrong. That's the end of the story, and there's no appeal. Now, argument number 4, the fourth class of arguments was non-exegetical and non-historical arguments. So there were a number of other arguments that were offered in these videos on behalf of either a 2030 second coming or a 2023 rapture that involved things like astrological signs in the heavens, including comets and stars and constellations and the planets, and gematria, and other varieties of numerology, and some pretty stretched typologies. Now, again, these arguments, despite their popularity and appeal, face two problems. Internal evidence. These arguments are just too far removed from biblical exegesis to be of any real value in answering biblical questions. And the use of these arguments more resembles superstition than trembling at the revelation that God has given us in the Bible. Folks, we need a return to the authority of Scripture. We need a return to Scripture as the only rule of faith and practice. Underline only. Put exclamation marks around it. And the second problem is external evidence. No matter how cool these arguments are, no matter how much they wow people, if they are contradicted by straightforward historical observations and chronological constraints which forbid an AD 30 cross, then they are just plain wrong. There's no more conversation. It's over. It's done. Now, I have as a foundation principle on this that non-exegetical arguments and non-historical arguments should immediately, absolutely, and unconditionally surrender to straightforward biblical revelation and straightforward historical facts. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these arguments because the bottom line is no matter how much they wow people, no matter how cool they are, no matter their gee whiz factor, if the historical facts and chronological constraints and biblical revelation forbid an AD 30 cross, then these arguments are just plain wrong. And there's no way to salvage them, and we should just walk away and be done. Now, the fifth class of arguments are chronological arguments that fudge the chronological constraints. Many of the videos I watched didn't even touch the actual chronological data that should be touched if you're going to talk about the year of the cross. Now, a few of them did touch these chronological issues in the chronological data. But when they did, they just presented the typical fudging of the chronological constraints that always accompanies the AD 30 cross theory. Now, I'm not going to go into these points right now because I am going to go into them later on in the video. So let's quickly summarize for your review the 5 classes of arguments that appear for the Messiah 2030 and for the Rapture 2023 theory. The first one is the 1,000 years as a day theory, or the 6,000 year theory. And like I said, I think this is super cool. I love this theory, but it is not proof, absolutely not proof of an AD 30 cross, much less an AD 2030 second coming and a 2023 rapture. Now, the 40-year oddities, or the 40-year phenomena in the rabbinical tradition, is also a pretty cool argument. Just assuming that they're true for the sake of argument here, I'm going to point out that these things are not proof of an AD 30 cross. I think they much better fit in AD 30 beginning of Christ's ministry in Jerusalem better than they fit in AD 30 cross. And if they fit AD 30 beginning of the Jerusalem ministry, then they fit in AD 33 cross. The sensational theories like the Bereshit prophecy in Genesis 1:1 have an undeniable wow factor, but they must give way to historical facts, chronological constraints, and biblical revelation. The non-exegetical and non-historical arguments appeal to many, but such arguments should never weigh heavy in the scale, and moreover they must always yield immediately and entirely to historical arguments and chronological constraints and biblical revelation. Lastly, the chronological arguments present the same fudging of the chronological constraints that always accompanies the AD 30 cross, and we need to make sure that when we deal with the chronological data, we don't fudge anything. If we can't get the data to come together in a cohesive way, just let it sit on the back burner. Don't force stuff to fit. When you force stuff to fit, you break stuff. That is not God's way. So the bottom line here is, folks, two of the classes of arguments don't give a definite or definitive statement on the timing of the cross. Two of the arguments, or classes of arguments, are of dubious value, and one just doesn't deal honestly with the chronological constraints in the historical data. So let's now turn to the historical facts, some of them stated in the Bible itself, and to the chronological considerations and chronological constraints that every real student of chronology must grapple with. The first chronological factor we need to deal with is the fact of the Friday the 14th of Nisan issue. All four Gospels inform us that Christ was crucified on Friday, Preparation Day. Preparation Day is simply the term for Friday. We know that Christ was crucified on the 14th of Nisan when the Passover lamb was slaughtered. And it seems reasonable to assume that Christ and his disciples celebrated the Passover or ate the Passover a day earlier according to the Galilean tradition, so that they ate the Passover together on the Galilee timetable and he was crucified on the typical timetable. But when we go with the Friday the 14th of Nisan, we have only two cross date options. We have AD 30 and AD 33. Those are the only 2 years where the 14th of Nisan lands on a Friday. And this constraint forces us to reject AD 31 and AD 32 as options that can be legitimately considered. If men are going to defend an AD 31 or AD 32 cross, they have to retreat from a Friday crucifixion and use a non-standard force of preparation and apply it to a Wednesday or a Thursday. And that's typically what folks do. Now, there's a whole bunch of constraints that deal with the question immediately at hand of whether or not we're going to go with AD 30 or potentially AD 33. These constraints include the fact that Christ's birth was significantly prior to Herod's death. Remember, he had the kids under 2 killed. Herod's death was preceded by an eclipse that was shortly before it and was followed by a Passover. We see this fact pointed out in Josephus's Antiquities 17.6.4 and in 17.9.3. Herod's death occurred between a fast and a Passover, not a feast and a Passover, a fast and a Passover. And we see this in Josephus's Antiquities 17.6.4. Christ's birth occurred during a Roman census. The start of Christ's ministry followed John's ministry by maybe 3 to 6 months. The start of John's ministry occurred in the 15th year of Tiberius. This is Luke chapter 3, verse 1. The start of Christ's ministry occurred when he was about 30 years old. We see this in Luke 3, verse 23, which means he was older than 29.5 and younger than 30.5. And most likely he was no more than 3 months on either side. If I was going to be pressed against the wall and forced to make a choice, I would say is probably more likely a few months over than a few months under. And if we locate the 30th year of his life, then we also have ramifications then that pertain to his birth date. Also, we have to deal with the length of Christ's ministry. It included at least 3 Passovers, which means his ministry was at least 2.5 years long. We see the 3 Passovers mentioned in John 2:13, John 6:4, and John 11:55. There's also evidence in the Synoptic Gospels that there was another harvest in between the first Passover mentioned in John and the second Passover mentioned in John. And if there was an extra harvest season, then there was an extra Passover. That brings us to 4 Passovers, and that's why scholars typically embrace the 4 Passovers understanding of Christ's ministry. So if we reckon 4 Passovers, then we have 3.5 years of ministry from the beginning of his ministry, and this affects both the date of the cross and the date of his birth. Now, I mention all these constraints for one purpose, and that's to point out we have to wrestle honestly with all of these constraints. We can't put them on the rack and stretch them, and we can't sweep them under the rug. We have to deal honestly with them, or we're not dealing honestly with the year of the cross. Now, the AD 30 cross faces 4 major chronological difficulties. Those 4 are the Tiberius issue, the eclipse issue, the census issue, and the about 30 years issue. And if men deal honestly with these constraints, they're going to find it nearly impossible to embrace an AD 30 crucifixion. So let's start with the first difficulty, which is the Tiberius issue. John the Baptist started his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius. This is Luke chapter 3, verse 1. Tiberius's 15th year started in either August or September of AD 28. This is determined by the standard Roman accession method of calculating the date of a reign, or the start of a reign. The accession method means simply the day he actually sat on the throne and was in office. Now, some count this reign from August 19th in AD 14, which is the day of the death of Augustus, and some count the reign from September 18th on AD 14, which was the day that Tiberius was confirmed by the Senate. Now, for all practical purposes, either one is sufficient because we're only talking about August or September. That's it, a 1-month difference. Now, the date of Tiberius's accession to the throne in AD 14 in either August or September is confirmed or supported by numerous historical, numismatic, and inscriptional evidence. Inscriptional evidence is stuff that's written on stone walls or painted on murals. Numismatic information is stuff that's printed on coins. And historical evidence is the stuff that's in the historians, and they all support the August-September accession to the throne of Tiberius. So the Roman historians didn't reckon Tiberius's throne or accession to the throne from his co-regency with Augustus Caesar, so we shouldn't do that manner of reckoning either. They used the standard Roman accession method. This means that John the Baptist started his ministry in either between mid-August AD 28 and mid-September AD 29. And then we know that Jesus started his ministry 3 to 6 months after John, so his could possibly still be in the 15th year of Tiberius or shortly thereafter. Now, Jesus' ministry then could start as early as maybe November AD 28, and it could start as late as maybe mid-March of AD 30. Normally, it's calculated that he started his ministry in the summer or fall of AD 29, which is kind of in the middle of the range. Now, but just for the sake of argument, if we pick the earliest possible date, which is the fall of AD 28 for the start of Christ's ministry, and we count the bare minimum 3 Passovers, because we have to count 3 Passovers, or we are right off the bat, right out of the gate, we're unbiblical. We come to Passover AD 31. And this is a belly flop, folks. It overshoots AD 30 by a whole year. Now, let me pull up a chart that portrays this Tiberius information for you so the facts don't go in one ear and out the other, or roll around a few times in your head, maybe catch fire and burn up and you forget about them. I'm going to give you a chart. Notice on the left of the chart that we have August and September AD 28 as the anniversary of Tiberius's accession to the throne, which happened in the fall of AD 14. That day there, that first day, is the start of the 15th year of Tiberius's reign. And that reign either ran from August AD 28 to August AD 29, or it ran from September AD 28 to September AD 29, depending on whether we count from Augustus Caesar's death or from Tiberius's Senate confirmation. But again, this is so close, it's almost irrelevant. Now, if we take the earliest possible date for John's ministry start, we're pinning him in August AD 28. And if we take the earliest possible date for Jesus' ministry start, we have him like maybe November AD 28. Now remember, the New Testament requires 3 Passovers minimum: John 2:23, John 6:4, John 13:1. So if we go with these 3 Passovers, and we count them, the first Passover would be AD 29. The second, because we started with his ministry, started in the fall of AD 28, so the first Passover would be AD 29. And then we go to the second Passover, AD 30, and the third Passover would be AD 31. Again, we have a big ugly belly flop here, because AD 31 does not work if you're angling for an AD 30 cross. Now, there's only 2 ways that you can get to an AD 30 cross when you're, if you're trying to deal with the Tiberius issue. The first one is to reject the Bible's clear testimony that there was at least 3, if not 4 Passovers, and you're just going to run with 2 Passovers, and a lot of people do that. Folks, that is trampling on Scripture. The second is to reject the historical testimony that Tiberius's reign should be marked from his actual accession to the throne in AD 14, and run with the theory that his reign should be counted from his co-regency with Augustus Caesar. Well, folks, the Roman historians themselves didn't count it that way. So we shouldn't be counting it that way either. Now, let's reverse the process. I want to work this Tiberius issue over really good. So let's start with as the theoretical AD 30 cross, and let's work backwards. So if we count 3 Passovers from AD 30, we have a Passover in AD 30, a Passover in AD 29, we have our third Passover in AD 28. And folks, we're already in Passover, which is the spring of AD 28. We're already prior to the start of the 15th year of Tiberius. Now, if we count back 6 further months, so that we go from the Lord's first Passover back to his baptism, we find ourselves in September or October of AD 27. And if we count back, let's just say 3 more months for the beginning of John's ministry, then we end up in June or July AD 27. And again, we have a big belly flop. Now we have John the Baptist and the Lord Jesus both starting their ministries prior to the 15th year of Tiberius, which is expressly against the plain statement of Scripture. So let me pull up a second Tiberius chart so that we can make sure that we get this information printed on our brains. Notice on the right that we're going to start counting Passovers backwards from AD 30. So we have a Passover in AD 30, Passover in AD 29, Passover in AD 28. Remember, the Bible requires us to have 3 Passovers. Now, the third Passover lands us in the spring of AD 28, which is prior to the 15th year of Tiberius, which started in the fall of AD 28. And if we back up 6 months from Jesus to his first Passover, from his first Passover to his baptism, now we're in November, maybe November of AD 27. And if we back up 3 more months to the start of John's ministry, now we're somewhere like maybe August AD 27. Folks, this again is a massive, massive belly flop. Both of these dates are far outside the 15th year of Tiberius. In fact, this situation here has John's ministry starting near the start of Tiberius's 14th year. So again, I'm going to point out that the only way to square an AD 30 cross with Tiberius is to either reject the Bible's testimony that there was at least 3 Passovers, or you have to reject the historical testimony that Tiberius's reign was reckoned from his actual accession of the throne in the fall of AD 14. So let's move on to the second difficulty, which is the eclipse issue. If we backdate from an AD 30 cross and we reckon 3 Passovers, which is the bare minimum, and count back another 6 months to Christ's baptism, then we have Christ beginning his ministry in the fall of AD 27 when he is about 30 years old. Now, if Jesus was about 30 years old in the fall of AD 27 at the beginning of his ministry, then he was born in the fall of 4 BC, give or take a few months. Well, this shoots us way past the eclipse that happened on January 9th in 1 BC and forces us to embrace the eclipse that happened on March 13th in 4 BC and use that eclipse as the one that's associated with Herod's death. But using this eclipse forces us to push Christ's birth back into 5 BC. You remember, Christ was born prior to Herod's death, and Herod had children up to 2 years old killed. Now, a 5 BC birth of Christ associated with a 4 BC eclipse appears to fit some of the constraints. It does have Christ's birth preceding Herod's death. It does have Herod dying between an eclipse and shortly before a Passover. And it does have Herod dying between a fast and a Passover because Purim was on March 12th to 14th somewhere between March 12th and March 14th in 4 BC. But there are a number of other constraints that pose serious difficulties for the 4 BC eclipse. Let's start with Herod's reign. Herod was granted title King of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 40 BC, but he didn't conquer Jerusalem and take the throne until somewhere like 37 or 36 BC. And he ruled for 37 or 36 years. The historians are off a little bit, so I figured that must have come right like in the middle between, are we going to count at 36 or count at 37 years? But if we count from his taking of the throne in BC 37, count 37 years, it takes us down to 1 BC. And that's far past the 4 BC eclipse. So folks are forced to count from the Roman decree in 40 BC rather than the actual accession of the throne in 37 BC if they're going to run with the 4 BC eclipse instead of the 1 BC eclipse. Now there's another problem with the eclipse, and that is that the eclipse in March of 4 BC was a minor eclipse and it was an obscure eclipse. It was really only about a 1/3 eclipse, and it occurred very late at night, so that it was not likely going to be seen by many people, and it was unlikely to be regarded as a significant omen. The third problem for the 4 BC eclipse is that the window between the eclipse and Passover is too small. The eclipse happened on March 13th, and Passover happened on April 10th, so there's less than a month between, and you got to remember that Herod died after the eclipse. Don't know if it was a few days or a week. Now, there's a whole bunch of events that are mentioned in historians like Josephus that happened between Herod's death and Passover. And it would be difficult to squeeze all of these events, which historically took place, into 3 or 4 weeks between Herod's death and Passover. And these complications suggest that we should be looking at the eclipse on January 9th of 1 BC. This eclipse, the eclipse in 1 BC, allows us to count 37 years from Herod's accession to the throne in 37 BC right down to his departure from the throne when he died in 1 BC. This 1 BC eclipse gives us a full eclipse, not a partial eclipse, a full eclipse, and it happened in prime time. And this eclipse also gives us nearly 4 full months between the eclipse on January 9th and the Passover on April 6th. So let me pull up a chart here to clarify this picture in your mind. Notice on the left that Herod's accession to the throne was in 37/36 BC, and the fact that he ruled for 36 or 37 years. Notice that the 4 BC eclipse and Passover are sandwiching Herod's death, and notice also that the 1 BC eclipse and Passover are sandwiching Herod's death. But notice that the 4 BC eclipse fails in several regards. First of all, it fails in the regard of the quality of the eclipse. Secondly, it fails in that there's insufficient time between his death and the Passover for all the events that are mentioned in the historians. And thirdly, the abbreviation of Herod's reign from his accession. If you run with the 4 BC eclipse and you're going to use his actual accession date, then you only have 34 years. And it's pretty clear that he reigned 37 years. The third difficulty is the census issue. Jesus' birth coincided with an empire-wide census. And if we backdate from an AD 30 cross, his birth doesn't coincide with the known empire-wide census that happened in that general era. So if we reckon 3 Passovers from AD 30, remember there's minimum 3 Passovers, and we count, and then we land in Passover AD 28, and then we count back another 6 months to his baptism. So we're going to be in the fall of AD 27 when he was about 30 years old. And if we count 30 years back from AD 27, we're going to find his birth in 4 BC or earlier. Now, the eclipse, as we pointed out, that was associated with Herod's death occurred in the spring of 4 BC, and our counting 30 years ended us in the fall of 4 BC. So we got to go back on the other side of that eclipse. So we got to push Christ's birth farther back. And we must go back to at least the fall of 5 BC, since Christ's birth precedes Herod's death, and Herod had children up to 2 years killed. But if we put the birth back in 5 BC, we're going to be looking for an empire-wide census in 5 BC. And we are going to be looking in vain, because the historical records record that the census was later, in 2 BC. Tertullian says the Roman records mentioned a census that was conducted in Israel at the time of Christ's birth while Saturninus was governor in Syria, which was in 3 and 2 BC. We also see that Augustus Caesar declared in a decree in autumn of 3 BC that required every inhabitant to give an oath of allegiance during the upcoming year, which means it had to be done by the autumn of 2 BC. And in the ancient Roman world, censuses and oaths of allegiance were often things that were combined. They went together. Now, this oath or this census was supposed to be completed by August of 2 BC, which was the 750th anniversary of the Roman Empire, and it also happened to be occurring during the 25th year of Augustus Caesar's reign. Also in Josephus, we read that there was a bunch of family and court intrigue that was associated with Augustus Caesar's demanded oath of allegiance. And all this stuff transpired 12 to 15 months prior to Herod's death. You can read about this in Josephus' Antiquities 17, 41 through 45. Now, this census does not harmonize with the 5 BC birth, 4 BC eclipse, and an AD 30 cross. But it readily harmonizes with a 2 BC birth, a 1 BC eclipse, and an AD 33 cross. Now, let's review this information one more time with a handy chart. I want this information to go home. I want this to be imprinted on your brain. So if we start on the right at the top and we count 3 Passovers back from AD 30 to AD 28, and then we go back 6 months to locate Christ's baptism and his ministry start in the fall of AD 27 when he was about 30 years old, And then we count back 30 years, we land in the fall of 4 BC, which is on the wrong side of Herod's death in the spring of 4 BC. So we have to bump Christ's birth back to 5 BC or earlier so that it precedes Herod's death. Now, I want you to notice here in this chart that when men cling to the AD 30 cross and count back to Christ's birth, they race right past the census or the oath that Augustus Caesar commanded in the fall of 3 BC. Now on the bottom right, let's look at the other option. Count 4 Passovers back from AD 33 to AD 30. So there's a Passover in AD 33, AD 32, AD 31, and AD 30. AD 30 was his first Passover. And we go back another 6 months and we locate Christ's ministry, beginning of his ministry and his baptism in the fall of AD 29. We count from there back 30 years. And we land in the summer of 2 BC. So notice this lands right in the time of the known census that was conducted by Caesar in 2 BC. Now, the fourth and final difficulty is the about 30 years issue. If we backdate from an AD 30 cross and we reckon 3 Passovers, again, the bare minimum, and we count back 6 months to Christ's birth, we locate his ministry start in AD 27 when he was about 30, and therefore his birth would be in the fall of 4 BC or earlier. And remember, because it's on the fall of 4 BC is on the wrong side of Herod's death and that eclipse, so we got to go the other way, so we end up in the fall of 5 BC. Now, when we try and work with an AD 30 cross and we get Christ's birth on the right side of Herod's death, so that we're going to be back in BC 5 or even BC 6, we run into a problem with the about 30, that the scriptures tell us that Christ was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. Because a fall of 5 BC birth has Christ about 31 when he began his ministry in the fall of AD 27. And if we back up to BC 6, which is where a lot of people go, now Christ is about 32 when he begins his ministry in the fall of AD 27. And this is not acceptable. About 30 means about 30. It does not mean about 31 or about 32. Folks, we have to stand fast on about 30. This isn't a broad generalization saying that Christ is somewhere between 25 and 35 years old. It is a reference to the fact that he began his ministry around the age of 30, which was the usual age that men began their priestly or rabbinical duties. He could have been a few months older or a few months younger. Most likely, he was probably a few months over. So let's look at a chart here to make sure that this about 30 issue goes completely home. If we start on the right at the top, we count 3 Passovers from AD 30 to AD 28. We go back 6 more months, we find Christ's ministry location in the fall of AD 27. We count back 30 years to get to the fall of BC 4. But we're on the wrong side of Herod's death. So we got to jump back to the fall of BC 5 or 5 BC. And this location leaves, for Christ's birth, leaves him about 31 when he begins his ministry in the fall of AD 27. And many people actually locate Christ's birth in BC 6, so they get more time between Christ's birth and Herod's death. And when they do that, now they have Christ being about 32 at the time of the start of his ministry. And this is a mistake. Now let's look at the other option that we have. Starting on the bottom right side, we count 4 Passovers from AD 33 back. So we have AD 33, AD 32, AD 31, and AD 30. We go back another 6 months to locate Christ's baptism, beginning of his ministry in the fall of AD 29. And we count back 30 years, we land in the summer of 2 BC. This location for Christ's birth leaves Christ about 30 at the start of his ministry. If we have it in June, which is where I think it is, then he's like 30 years and a few months. And this about 30 is exactly what the Bible says. So again, we're being very biblical here. Now, an AD 30 cross requires men to fudge the constraints. To defend that cross, men are going to have to take some or many of these constraints, depending upon which theory they're using, place them on the rack, and torture them until they confess what the torturers want to hear. For instance, they must count Tiberius's reign from his co-regency with Augustus, though the Romans themselves counted it from his accession. They must reckon Herod's reign from the Senate decree in 40 BC rather than from his actual accession to the throne in somewhere in 37 or 36 BC. They must run with 2 Passovers instead of the biblical 3 or 4. They must rest about 30 to mean about 31 or about 32, sometimes even about 33. They must invoke an empire-wide census that doesn't appear in history and place it like in 5 or 6 BC. They must embrace a 1/3 eclipse late at night and reject a full eclipse in prime time. They must tolerate less than a month between Herod's death and Passover, though the sequence of events that's recorded in history likely requires 2 months or more. Folks, I want to point out that when theories trample on the evidence and deal unjustly with the evidence, science dies and superstition reigns. And many of the things that we believe as Christians are going to ultimately prove to be superstition because they're not based on the plain statements of Scripture or the plain facts of history or the plain facts of science. They're theories that are popular, that trample on science, that trample on history, that trample on the Bible, that trample on Greek and Hebrew grammar. Now, when men are on the path of science, they can make mistakes. But they can be corrected if you have enough love and patience. But when men are on the path of superstition, it's almost impossible to correct them. Folks, make sure in your heart that you are before God on the path of science, that you're going to follow the Bible as the only rule of faith and practice, that you're going to trust the revelation of God, that you're going to trust what are the actual facts of grammar, the actual facts of history, and the actual facts of science. Now, I want to point out that an AD 33 cross fits all of the constraints that we've been dealing with. None of them raise a problem for an AD 33 cross. We're allowed, we can count Tiberius's reign from his accession in August or September of AD 14, which that's the standard Roman practice. We can count Herod's 37-year reign from his accession in 37 or 36 BC. Again, we're now able to follow the standard Roman practice. We're able to embrace all 4 Passovers that we see in the New Testament, the 3 that are plainly mentioned in the Gospel of John, and the one that's implied in the Synoptic Gospels because there's an extra harvest season between the first Passover in John and the second Passover in John, and that extra harvest season implies an extra Passover season. We actually have John and Christ beginning their ministries in the 15th year of Tiberius, or maybe Christ is early in the beginning of the 16th year. We have Jesus beginning his ministry when he was about 30 and not about 31 or not about 32 or not about 33. We actually have Christ's birth occurring during a historical Roman census that occurred in 2 BC. We have an eclipse that's associated with Herod's death, which is a full eclipse, and it's a prime time eclipse. And we have 4 months between the eclipse in January 9th of 1 BC and Passover on maybe April 6th or 7th of 1 BC. So there's plenty of time for all the events to occur that are recorded in historians like Josephus. Now let me give you the main points of the AD 33 cross chronology. Herod is seated to the throne in 37 or 36 BC. Christ was conceived probably in the fall, like September of 3 BC. Now, some people like Martin give an exact date. They say September 11th, which was the Feast of Trumpets, and he wants to use that for the date of Christ's birth. I suspect if that date is correct, it's likely going to be the date of Christ's conception, which would be where his incarnation starts. We have the census or the oath of allegiance commanded in the fall of 3 BC and finished by the fall of 2 BC. Christ was born in the summer of 2 BC. I suspect it was probably June. We have an eclipse in Herod's death in 1 BC after ruling for 37 years. We have Tiberius acceding to the throne in August or September of AD 14. We have John the Baptist beginning his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius, which would be somewhere in the late spring or early summer of AD 29. We have Christ beginning his ministry a few months later in the summer or fall of AD 29 when he was about 30. If we count from June 2 BC to June AD 29, we have 30 years. If we count from like August 2 BC to August AD 29, again, we have 30 years. So no matter where we go with this, we can have that birth and the beginning of the ministry bounce back and forth a couple months either way. It's no issue. We are about 30 years. And we have 4 Passovers. We have the first Passover on Nisan 14 in 30 AD or AD 30, which is mentioned in John 2:13. We have a second Passover, which would have been in AD 31, which is implied by the extra harvest that's mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels. We have a third Passover in AD 32, which is mentioned in John 6:4. And we have the fourth Passover in AD 33, John 11:55, where Christ was slain. He was slain on Friday, the 14th of Nisan, according to the scriptures, on his fourth Passover. So in conclusion, folks, the 2030 Messiah argument for a 2023 rapture is completely bankrupt. The 6,000-year theory and the 40-year phenomena from the rabbinical literature don't make a definitive argument for AD 30. In fact, they coincide nicely with an AD 33 cross. The sensational arguments, like the supposed Bereshit prophecy in Genesis 1:1, and the non-exegetical arguments, like the astrological sign arguments, are dubious at best. And the standard chronological arguments for an AD 30 cross must be rejected because they fudge the chronological constraints to make an AD 30 cross square with the Bible and with history. And we do not want to go down that path. But my opinion of all these arguments now is really it's small potatoes, because the gorilla in the room is the historical facts and the chronological constraints. And if we let them say what they want to say and imply what they want to imply, they absolutely forbid an AD 30 cross. And if the AD 30 cross is overthrown, then the 2030 Messiah theory is overthrown. And so is the argument for a 2023 rapture that is drawn from the 2030 Messiah theory. Now let me give a point of clarification here. Overthrowing the 2030 Messiah theory isn't attacking imminence or the nearness of the rapture. And overthrowing the 2030 Messiah theory doesn't mean the rapture can't happen this year, even this fall, even this week, even tonight. All overthrowing the 2030 Messiah theory means is that if the rapture happens this month or this year, it won't have anything to do with the 2030 Messiah theory. If it happens, it was just a matter of the fact that God chose a day way back prior to the creation of the world for the day of the rapture. That's the only reason it's going to happen. And because that's on his timetable, we see all the prophetic convergence swirling around us. I also want to remind you that the evidence for the AD 33 cross is pretty formidable. I think it should be considered, folks. But hopefully, we're not going to get hit by a new slew of videos that touting the 2033 Messiah theory is the new surefire method for dating the rapture. Folks, we have no idea how big the window is between the rapture and the beginning of the 70th week. We don't know if we got weeks or months or years, so you can't use this for a rapture dating theory. The only thing you can use it for is just one more component of prophetic convergence. It belongs in the same category of prophetic convergence things as the fig tree generation does. The fact of the matter is the rapture could happen this fall, could happen next year, could happen the following year, it could happen in 2026. It could go longer than we might hope. We might have missed a variable that belongs in the equation. Now, don't let this video dampen your excitement about the rapture. It's not intended to dampen your excitement about the rapture. I'm excited about the rapture. I wake up in the morning thinking about it. I go through every day thinking about it. I go to bed at night thinking about it. I can hardly wait to see my Messiah. This is not intended to dampen anyone's excitement for the rapture. It is only intended to dampen excitement about a rapture dating theory that will be going belly up in the near future, just like every other dating theory has gone belly up for the past 4 decades. You don't need the sensationalism, the hype, and the high watch rapture theories to be excited about the soon coming of the Lord Jesus. You can throw the sensationalism out, you can throw the hype out, you can throw the high watch rapture theories out, and you can still be absolutely insanely excited about the coming rapture. I am. You can be excited about the imminence of the rapture. I am. You can be excited about the prophetic phenomena which tells us the rapture is close. I am. All you need to be excited is the generic promise of the soon coming of the Lord, and to look around and see the prophetic convergence. That's all you need. So be excited about the rapture, folks. Prophetic convergence is accelerating, and we are getting close to redlining. This means that we are going home soon, very soon. So keep looking up, keep watching, keep hoping, keep fighting the good fight, keep preaching the gospel, keep occupying until he comes, but keep looking up. Eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire. We'll see you next time.